Good afternoon once again, and welcome to this afternoon's event. Please welcome UMaine Dean of Libraries, Joyce Rummery.
Hello. I'd like to welcome you to the University of Maine this afternoon. Fogler Library is very pleased to be co-hosting with the William S. Cohen Center for International Policy and Commerce the 10th anniversary events which celebrate the donation of the Cohen Papers in 1997 and the beginning of the Cohen Lecture Series. The papers, which arrived on campus in 1,300 boxes for the congressional years and 16 CDs for the Pentagon years, document over a quarter century of service to Maine and our nation, spanning 6 presidencies, 2 historical constitutional crises, the end of the Cold War, and thousands of votes in Congress. We are extremely grateful for the support of our sponsors for today's events: Bangor Daily News, WLBZ2, WCSH6 and the Garnett Foundation, Allen Miller Fund for Excellence in Communication and Journalism, the Honors College, and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. To recognize the role of our distinguished guests in the Watergate investigations, we've put together a short video of archival material from several sources, including the Woodward and Bernstein papers at the University of Texas and the William S. Cohen papers in special collections here at Fogler Library. Many of us will experience a bit of time travel as we watch, while for our younger audience members, we'll provide an introduction to today's conversation on Watergate. I hope you enjoy this video presentation and the rest of today's forum. Thank you for joining us here today.
We had done some of the first work on this, that any suggestion that we had caused it or brought down a president was a stretch, to say the least, and not factual.
If the missing tape had not been released in that summer of 1974, in all probability, I would not have been reelected.
It is a process of the judiciary, the Congress, the Supreme Court, that led to Nixon's demise. But then, of course, if you think about it, Nixon is the one who did himself in.
And at some point in time, he could have gone to the American people and said, we made some mistakes. I let this thing get out of hand. There was wrongdoing that took place.
The important discovery for Carl and myself was that Watergate wasn't isolated. There were other burglaries. There was a whole intelligence gathering apparatus. There were spies in all the Democratic candidates' campaigns that had been planted and were paid by the Nixon campaign.
I think the Watergate has certainly cast a very dark shadow over the Republican Party and the administration. There's been a great deal of doubt and cynicism that's been generated as a result of what they call the Saturday Massacre.
Senator, will President Nixon be invited or perhaps even subpoenaed to testify before the Senate committee?
I very much doubt that you can subpoena a president to do anything, except possibly to stand before the bar of the Senate in the case of the trial of articles of impeachment returned by the House of Representatives.
To go to the center of the matter, is the president under investigation by the Senate committee?
We are going to examine every lead, we're going to examine every suggestion, and we're going to take into account every statement wherever that leads us.
100,000 pages of documents from the Senate Watergate Committee, all of the material from the grand jury, also all of that was turned over to Jaworski's office, in addition to all of the hearings that were held on the confirmation of Kleindienst and Richardson and Henry Kissinger and others. It's an overwhelming amount of material.
Let's examine what the president did know as of that time. But I look at page 10, and I read from what the president said. I want the most comprehensive notes on all of those that have tried to do us in because they didn't have to do it. And Dean says that's right. They didn't have to do it. Circumstantial evidence is just as valid evidence in the life of the law and that of logic as is direct evidence. In fact, sometimes I think it's much stronger. If you went to sleep at night and the ground was bare outside, and you woke up with fresh snow on the ground,
If you go to bed at night, there's no snow on the ground. You wake up and there's snow on the ground.
then certainly you would conclude as a reasonable person that snow had fallen even if you hadn't seen it. There are some who would have you believe that the White House has been under unfair and unmitigated assault by this Congress, aided and abetted by the liberal press. I happen to think that some of the gravest, the most melancholy of wounds are those that are self-inflicted. I've been faced with the terrible responsibility of assessing the conduct of a president that I voted for, believed to be the best man to lead this country, who has made significant and lasting contributions towards securing peace in this country, throughout the world, but a president who in the process, by act or acquiescence, allowed the rule of law and the Constitution to slip under the boots of indifference and arrogance and abuse.
The vision or the dream of the people who wrote the Constitution has, at least in part, been realized.
Our laws and our Constitution are, and they must be, more than a pious wish, more than a sanctimonious recital of what we should prefer but will not insist upon. Because we who hold the public office are more than simply craftsmen and draftsmen who hammer out legislation for the benefit of the people of this country. We're the keepers of the flame.
Please join us in a warm, humane welcome for former Secretary of Defense William Cohen, Washington Post Assistant Managing Editor Bob Woodward, and this afternoon's moderator, News Center journalist Don Kerrigan.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Don Kerrigan. I was a student here on this campus in 1972 when the break-in occurred. Matter of fact, I was among the classes I had taken the year before was instructor Bill Cohen's business law class. So more memorable for me than for him, I'm sure. Political history and two people who have been players on the national and world stage for 35 years, ever since those events of Watergate. Thank you both for taking the time to be with us here today. And I guess if we could start, I might ask you both to just share a few recollections, a few thoughts about Watergate, and especially in how you looked at it then, how you looked at it now, and then we can get to some questions, and then we will get to some questions from all of you in a few minutes. Secretary Cohen?
Well, Don, thank you very much, and thanks for being such a a gifted reporter in your own right, and we have full disclosure. Don also worked for me for a period of time, so
I took a break.
Not exactly unbiased in terms of the questions that I may anticipate. But let me say very quickly, I think what comes to my mind is how unpredictable life is. When I first was elected to the Congress, I was selected to go to the JFK Institute of Politics. There were 4 of us at that time. A young man by the name of Alan Steelman from Dallas, Yvonne Braithwaite-Burke from California, Barbara Jordan from Houston, and myself. And we spent some time at the Institute, and I had Professor Moynihan was one of my professors. Professor Galbraith was a professor. And frankly, I don't recall anything that I learned at Harvard at that time, other than the director of the program said that when you get to Washington, when they ask you for the list of committees you want to be on, make sure the committee you really want to be on, you put last. And I thought, wow, that's counterintuitive. Why would I want to do that? They said, because they will not trust you. They don't know who you are, and they're going to want to make sure that they can judge how you're going to perform for the party and for the Congress. So just remember, put it last. And so I went to Washington, and over the objection of my then very small staff, I put the Judiciary Committee as the last choice on 5 that I listed. And that's where I ended up. And so I think about the choices that we make in life and how you can think you're setting out to do something and have no way of knowing what the future is going to hold. For me, Watergate simply symbolized the axiom that all power is corrupt, absolute power being absolutely corrupt, and that when you have such a concentration of power, inevitably it will lead to abuse. Unless you have serious checks and balances. It can come from one party or the other, another branch of government or the media. But you must have constant vigilance and scrutiny and openness of a political process. I will tell you one other insight into my experience on the House Judiciary Committee. I was not prepared for the kind of intense partisanship that existed on the committee, how Democrats and Republicans really didn't like each other. And there was no trust amongst the members of the committee. And I recall the time that Peter Rodino was he had sent a letter off to President Nixon asking him to release all of the tapes. And President Nixon wrote back and said no. He went on television. Instead, he held a nationwide press conference in which he had all of the edited transcripts stacked up behind the Oval Office desk. And he said something to the effect of, never have conversations so private but made so public. And he turned those over to the committee, and the next day, the committee started to deliberate on this. What were we going to do? And Republicans, Rodino wanted to send another letter to the president saying, this is not what he asked for. It's like being stopped by a policeman, and he asks you for your driver's license, and you give him his credit card. And so he wanted to write another letter. And I recall being in a room that afternoon in which this was being discussed as to why edited transcripts were not sufficient compliance. And to a person in that room, they said, we don't care what the rationale is. We're not going to be part of any letter going to the president. The Democrats are simply trying to turn over the election, which they justifiably lost. And I remember going back to my office that I asked a question. I said, what if Rodino only wants to send a letter very respectfully and say, please give us what we asked for? They said, no letters. And I said, what if I write a letter? They said, no letters. And they started to take a vote. How many will stand together with the president? And I got up and I left the room. And I went back to my office and I wrote a 2 or 3 page letter. And I printed up 37 copies. And I got to the hearing room that night and I passed them out to every member. And I was determined to say, you must comply with our requests. I will do so in a respectful way, but I'm determined to get to the facts. And I can recall that evening was a pivotal moment for me because it passed by only 1 vote that night, and my vote happened to break the tie. And it was a very tough reaction toward me for doing that. But I felt it was so important to get to the facts that that was something I needed to do. That's my memory of that.
Mr. Woodward?
Real quickly, one of the questions that continually gets raised is, what was Watergate? It was technically a burglary in the political opposition headquarters, but what all reporting and investigations showed conclusively is that it really was an assault on the Constitution, the rule of law, and as you may know, even today there are so many Nixon tapes. They come out, there's a season that does not go by when there's not a new batch that are released publicly. At the Washington Post, we call it the gift that keeps giving. And it's astonishing to listen to those tapes or read the transcripts because you see multiple things. Nixon willing to break the law, anxious to break the law, ordering aides to stonewall the grand jury, abuse of power, a deep sense he had that somehow the presidency could be used as an instrument of personal revenge. If you didn't like a congressman, you would try to do something very damaging or maybe even illegal. If you didn't like the Democratic Party or the nominees, you set up an extensive campaign of espionage and sabotage against the Democratic candidates, and it went on and on, was funded by hundreds of thousands of dollars. So law-breaking, abuse of power, but also when you listen to lots of these tapes, you find that the biggest tragedy is the smallness of Nixon, that the large purpose of the presidency to do good for the maximum number of people was rarely evident, that the dog that doesn't bark on the Nixon tapes, I never recall Nixon or any of his aides in what I've read or listened ever saying, what's good, what's right. It was always about Nixon. Let's screw somebody who's an enemy or a perceived enemy, or let's benefit, give ambassadorships or government favors to people who'd given large contributions. So that's it's criminality, it's abuse of power, but it's smallness. And if you look at the Watergate record, and we're never going to have anything that compares to it, that so many tapes, almost all the people who worked for Nixon wrote memoirs or testified in a trial or one legal proceeding, the House impeachment inquiry, the Senate Watergate Committee, the Special Prosecutor Office, and there's a mountain of evidence. And then people wrote things down in memos, an enemies list. Now, I think there are lots of politicians who have enemies lists, but only in the Nixon White House would they actually write it down. So it is, as we get many decades beyond what Watergate was in Nixon's departure from office, I think if I ever wrote another book about Nixon and Watergate, which I don't plan to do, but if I did, it would be called The Wrong Man, that he was somebody, he was an aberration. He was somebody disconnected with all of, or too many of the principles that are supposed to guide the conduct of the presidency under law. And that the memory of it, because it now really is a memory, gets you to thinking about what should you worry about in terms of another Watergate. And the corrosive trail to Watergate is government secrecy. And that, yes, some things need to be secret in government, military plans, intelligence sources, and so forth, but what Nixon essentially did is he tried to wall himself off and say, we own the government, it's ours, we can do whatever we want. And that the remedy is transparency. And I've known Bill Cohen since 1974, and what is interesting about you, and you often didn't like it, or you were annoyed, or I would be reporting about the CIA or the military, or when you're Secretary of Defense, or what the Congress is doing, but you always believed in not just sufficient transparency, but as much transparency in government as possible. And I think that's the lesson you took from Watergate, is that it's often easier to say, no, I'm not going to talk, we don't have to answer that. But in fact, even though it's not written down, that's your duty.
That means I answered his phone calls every day.
But did you answer them the first time, or did that develop
No.
over the years? Guys, 5,000 questions to ask here, but let's start with Richard Nixon. In the tape that we just saw, why you make reference in one of your speeches on the committee. I presume that's the speech the day that you announced how you were going to vote.
That was the day we took the vote.
You took the vote.
Right.
And you talked about how he was your president, you believed in him, you voted for him and such. And I believe, Mr. Woodward, that you either were at that point or had been a Republican yourself.
I was a recovering Republican.
At the outset of this investigation, did you folks basically believe the White House, believe the president, say he couldn't have been involved or responsible for anything like this? Or were either of you doubters from the beginning?
I had spent the previous 6 years either prosecuting cases or defending cases. And my mindset was, let's look at the facts. Wherever they take us, let's follow the facts. And so I think a transformational moment for me was I was sitting over in Lewiston watching a hockey game. And this was the night of the Saturday Night Massacre.
Maybe we need to very quickly remind people what that was.
It's when...
What's Lewiston?
Or where is Lewiston?
Lewiston got him elected.
It's presumably in Maine.
It is presumably in Maine. Everybody here, I think, knows where Lewiston is.
Like you, I'm a believer in the facts.
It reminds me of the time the joke was there was some graffiti scribbled on a wall, and the question was, is there intelligent life on Earth? And Bob got out of the car and said, yes, but I'm only visiting. In any event, I was watching a hockey game over in Lewiston, Maine, and the reporter came up and said, have you heard, he put a microphone in my face and said, have you heard that really Elliot Richardson has just resigned
as
Attorney General, and that Archibald Cox has been fired.
He was the special prosecutor.
Possibly.
There's some kids in the audience.
And I said, well, that's got to be a mistake. Can't be true. Come back after the next period, and we'll see if you can verify it. Came back and no, it's true. And at that moment, I knew something had really transpired. I was a good friend of Elliot Richardson, and a close friend. And when he resigned because he would not fire Mr. Cox, I knew that something was brewing that was going to be far deeper than anything that we suspected at that time. So my mindset was, I don't know what the facts are, but I'm going to find out what the facts are. I'm not going to simply be a party loyalist, although it's called upon me almost every week. We would gather as members of the Republican members of the Judiciary Committee to meet with the House leader, Republican leader, and they would go around the table and say, okay, what happened this week? And basically it was trying to force us to conform and stay together as a party. In fact, I recall going down to the White House one time, and all of us went down, and President Nixon was there, and he was giving a rallying speech, and he got up and he said, you have a mixed audience here, but he said, I may be a son of a bitch, but you know that I'm your son of a bitch. And all of the Republicans stood up and started cheering. And it was one of those rally around the president, no matter what the facts were. And I found myself, it was difficult for me and impossible for me to do that. And what I said, look, if I still believed, as I saw this comment, I still believed well into the investigation that had President Nixon simply come forward and said, look, this is what's happened. By tone or content, I set this thing in motion. I made a big mistake. I have acted inconsistent with my obligations. We were under pressure, the threat of a war in the Middle East. We have all of these tensions, maybe going to war, and I made a big mistake. I was willing to believe that if he had done that, until well into the investigation, the American people would have forgiven. They would have said, we disapprove of what you've done, but the government would have continued. And when he didn't do that, then I became convinced that there was no choice. And as I listened to tape after tape after tape, and I matched it up with all of the edited transcripts. And what I did was something that I think no other member of the committee did this. I memorized all of the hearings that took place in the Senate Watergate investigation verbatim. And then went back and listened to all the tapes, and whenever a witness came before the committee, if they changed one word of their testimony, I knew in my own mind where that differentiation was or difference was. And so that's how determined I was to get to the truth and to the facts, regardless of whether it came out in favor or against the president.
Bob Woodward, where I question was sort of a pivotal moment, and did you at first believe that President Nixon could not be part of this?
No, I thought it was inconceivable, and the conventional wisdom in Washington was that Nixon's too smart to be involved in this. But in reporting the story, again, it's very much the process that Secretary Cohen is talking about. What are the facts? What's the story? And you do it incrementally. And what we found from the sources we talked to and the documents that there was a conspiratorial, clandestine funding of all the Watergate-style operations, and then led right into the White House to the president's top aides, to former Attorney General John Mitchell, and so forth. And we published these stories before the 1972 election, which Nixon won by a landslide. And quite frankly, people didn't believe them. Our colleagues at the Washington Post didn't believe it. And the variable for Carl Bernstein and myself was the editors and the owner of the Washington Post, particularly Catherine Graham, who was the publisher and owner of the Post at that time. And I remember a moment, January 1973, and again, Watergate is a blip. We've written many stories accusing the White House of conspiracy, and Catherine Graham called me up to her dining room at the Post for lunch. And I knew her, but not well at all, and I remember being concerned about what this is going to be about, and walking into her dining room, and she gave me this look of, "What have you boys been doing with my newspaper?" And somebody said, there's not such a look. And I said, if you'd been there, you would have recognized the look. She was supportive, but had questions. And we sat down to lunch, and my mind was blown away, quite frankly, by the number of questions she had about Watergate and the knowledge. And she had what I later described as a management style, which in many ways is perfect, which is hands-off, mind-on, intellectually engaged with what we're doing, why we're doing it, but hands-off in terms of telling editors how to edit, reporters how to report. And at the end, she had the killer question, which was, when are we going to find the whole truth about Watergate? Now, this is before any testimony, this is before any trial, this is before even the knowledge of the taping system. And I said that Carl Bernstein and I felt, because it was criminal conspiracy, because people in the White House had been frightened, because they compartmentalized information, the answer was never. We were never going to know the full story. And I remember across the lunch table, she had this pained, stricken look on her face. And she said, "Never? Don't tell me never." I left that lunch a motivated employee. But it wasn't and I'm sorry, this is so long-winded, but it was not a threat. It was a statement of purpose. She said, use your resources, the resources of this newspaper, to get to the bottom of this story. It is our responsibility to do that and leave no stone unturned. In that environment, as a reporter, you're turned loose. It is this process. Find out what happened and don't stop. Don't tell me never. And that atmosphere and environment allowed us to keep working on the story. Lots of people, I mean, right at this moment, the Post stock had gone public, and Nixon had people attacking the Washington Post FCC licenses of television stations, so that stock was down, and a lot of owners would have said, stop, back off, I don't want to know. And this is a case where somebody said, not only do I want to know, but we have to know.
It's an odd question. What if the cover-up had worked? First of all, how close did it come to working? And what if it had worked? What if this had never been revealed? What would have happened to the country?
Well, I think you would have seen a consistent pattern of abuse. Bob talked about what the criminality involved. There were two major articles of impeachment. One was abuse of power, and the other was the cover-up and the criminal activity involved in terms of obstruction of justice, the payment of hush money. Those activities being carried on by the President of the United States is completely inconsistent with what we expect and deserve out of a constitutional form of government. So you would have had a continuation of the kinds of practices of intimidation, keeping the enemies list, using neutral instruments of government in order to investigate or intimidate political opponents. You would, Bob and I talked about this on the way up the plane, and I'll yield to him because he has a whole series of cascading things that would have happened that would not have happened but for the investigation that revealed the nature of the abuse.
And are you confident that those sorts of abuses have not happened since?
No. No, not at all. What I said in the beginning was, all power is corrupt. That's, Lord Acton. And it's true today. That's one of the reasons I think we're seeing the reaction amongst the American people, that when you have one party in charge of everything, then the potential for abuse becomes much more real and becomes realized. And then when people feel they don't have to account to the other party, to the other institutions of government, to the press, to the people, that we're in charge, we won, it's ours, then you have no restraint on the power of government, and that's when you get inevitable abuse. And I think we've seen example after example in this administration as well.
But the cover-up worked for a long time. Took 2.5 years to finally have a day of reckoning about this. And if it had worked, I agree that there would have been this sense of there's no accountability. But I think the sadness would have been there would not have been that wonderful lesson of Watergate. And the wonderful lesson of Watergate is, and almost paradoxically, it is Nixon himself who found the ultimate lesson of Watergate in the day he resigned the presidency. You may recall, he went on television the day before and said, I'm resigning. And the day of his resignation in August 1974, he called all of his cabinet, senior staff, the press, cameras, into the East Room of the White House, and he gave a speech that with no script, and he talked about his wife, 2 daughters, 2 brothers, their husbands were behind him, and he was sweating, and he was saying, talking about his mother and his father, and reading from Teddy Roosevelt's diary, literally reading T.R.'s diary about the death of his wife, which T.R. writes, the light went out of my life forever, almost comparing the loss of the presidency with the loss of your wife. And as people commented at the time, lots of people in the White House, this was a psychiatric hour for Nixon almost. But then with his wonderful body language, he kind of said at the end, this is why I called you here. This is what I want you to take away. And then he said, always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself. Now think about the wisdom of that. At that moment, he realized that the piston driving his presidency and him was hate. And he said, the poison of hate destroys. And that's the big lesson of Watergate for me. In your personal life and in politics and everything, that hate will do you in. And Nixon, you have to give him credit for identifying that at the worst moment of his life, perhaps, where he had to give up the presidency, which he had spent all of his life trying to attain to, and then understanding that hate destroys. And that for me, that it goes to your poetry. I mean, hate does destroy. Hate is the thing that we need to get out of American politics. We need to get out of our personal lives. And it's true. You hate and you destroy yourself.
One quick thing in answer. Bob had pointed this out to me. If we had not had the investigation and Richard Nixon continued in office, you would not have had a Gerald Ford. If you did not have a Gerald Ford, you unlikely would you wouldn't have had a Jimmy Carter. If you didn't have Jimmy Carter, you wouldn't have had a Ronald Reagan. If you didn't have Ronald Reagan, you wouldn't have had a President Bush 41, and who on the ticket. If you didn't have President Bush 41, you certainly wouldn't have President Bush 43. Mm-hmm. So a lot would have changed in our lives.
So it's all your fault.
So this is why I'm here.
And if that speech you had given went something like this, in the morning you wake up and there's snow on the ground, you don't know whether it snowed, and you can't be absolutely sure.
Well, since you mentioned more recent presidents, I want to ask a media question in particular. Got a media expert here, and I'm a media guy. And can you compare? Certainly, the media did not like Richard Nixon. A lot of the members of the press did not, and a lot of members of the press don't care for George Bush. Can you compare the atmosphere, the relationship between the press and those two presidents?
I mean, real quickly, I think liking or not liking a president should have zero to do with your coverage. I never disliked Nixon, and never, in the case of Bush, I've interviewed Bush more than any reporter, and he's granted me hours of interviews about substantive matters like deciding to go to war in Iraq and so forth. I think the problem is that in the White, I have to give there's something in the White House air handling system, the air conditioning system, the heating system, that gets people to think that they need to, that they've got the ball all the time, and that there is no accountability, and that people who are trying to make them accountable are somehow off base. And that leads to this poison and this distrust. And I've always tried to push against it. I have always gone, in the case of Watergate, we went to the White House many times saying, we want to talk to the president. We want answers to these questions. We want his side of the story. So the difficulty is all the opposition to a president gets lumped together. There's the other party, and so then they say, well, the press is asking the same question as the other party, so they're all part of the enemies. And I think that's poison, and in the end, it will destroy.
Some of the same feelings that you refer to with President Nixon.
You mean now?
No, with the hatred, the sort of those good feelings.
Sure.
As
I
you
mean,
mentioned.
he clearly. I mean, look, read the tapes. I mean, he was anti-Semitic. He was anti-black. As somebody said, he was anti-everyone. He just and a venom in seeing conspiracies and people thinking when the labor statistics come out about unemployment, what is he doesn't like them, and so Nixon asked, well, how many Jews are there in the Bureau of Labor Statistics? And then gets this crazy idea that there are that the Jews are doing this to him, and it is just an outrage. But you know, there it is on the tapes.
Secretary Cohen, just briefly your thought on the media versus White House relationship, the two times, then and now.
I think it depends on what the president thinks about the press. In other words, if you dislike the press and you distrust the press, then you're going to set an emotional relationship with the press that's going to be more antagonistic. If you respect the press, know they've got a job to do, and you're as forthright as you possibly can be, understanding you have things you can't say, but if you treat them with respect, then you'll be treated with respect. If you compare Richard Nixon and say, well, okay, how did they treat Jerry Ford? Much different, even with the pardon. Or how do they treat President Bush 41? President Bush 41, he liked the press. He liked dealing with them. And I think he got a different brand of treatment. Same with President Clinton as you go up through. And I'd say, frankly, President Bush 43, the current president, press members tend to like him personally when they're dealing one-on-one with him, very engaging. I don't see them beating up on him with the kind of animus that might have been directed toward Richard Nixon. They're piling up now because of what has happened and because of the same traits that were evident back during the Watergate in terms of circling the wagons, not being forthcoming, seeing the enemy all around and buttoning down. I think those are the reasons why you're seeing the press change at this moment. But I think that he's had, up to this most recent point, pretty good relations with the press.
Could a cover-up like Watergate happen now in the age of bloggers and the internet and all that? We saw the thing with CBS and during the last presidential election and their documents about President Bush that bloggers and the internet blew up. Could that sort of cover-up happen today?
Well, you had 4 or 5 years, basically, where you had pretty much stonewalling and dealing with a war. In terms of what was going on, what was being said, what was the reality, what were the memos that were being given to the president, what was the intelligence being given to the president, what was the reporting being given from the White House to the American people. It can only go on so long. Ultimately, the facts will come out, just a question of how long it takes. My concern with what is taking place today with the democratization of information is that there's no filter left any longer. At least if you're talking the Washington Post, the New York Times, the major networks, usually they have seasoned people in charge of looking at the information, making assessments, and deciding what is fit to print, what is not. I think today we have no filter. Eventually, what will happen as you look in the blogosphere, the people will come to say, well, that one's okay, these two are okay, and that one don't trust it. So there'll be this kind of correction, a self-correction mechanism where, because of the proliferation of the blogs, people will come to say only these are trustworthy because the people who are doing the reporting or the investigating have established a reputation. But I think it's going to be more difficult to have any kind of a cover-up in the future.
Do you agree with that?
Well, first of all, I don't think the blogs are going to uncover a cover-up. That's done by detailed, persistent, well-thought-out reporting, and I don't think there's a whole lot of that in the blogosphere. The difficulty is the two driving forces in the media today are speed and impatience. Give it to us fast, and I want it now. Well, good reporting to understand what's going on involves slow and patient, the exact opposite. I'm not worried about the blogs or the cable channels, and some of it's very good and informative, but it creates a sense in a newsroom if you have an incremental advance on a story. And my impulse then is to take it and go do a book on it that will come out 18 months or 2 years later, particularly if it's important. The spirit of the Times in the newsroom, oh, you've got something, can we get it on the website by noon? Well, if you get everything on the website by noon, you don't get to the truth. You don't really dig into it. And it is a process that takes weeks and months. I think in the news media, what we have to do is convince people we have a product that is valuable, and you demonstrate that by doing it, by telling people that, in the old newspaper world, they used to call it a bacon cooler. Do you know what a bacon cooler is?
I have not heard
No, you haven't. It's something that these two
Is it
old-timers
near
don't
Lewiston?
know.
Is it near Lewiston, Maine?
I'll bet this happens in Lewiston, Maine. A bacon cooler is a story that is in the newspaper that's so good that somebody is reading it and they get the bacon on the fork and they don't even want to interrupt to put it in their mouth. And so the bacon cools on the fork. Now, there are not many bacon coolers in my business, but that's what you aspire to. And if we are able to do it more and more in a persuasive way, it's like any product. It's like a good car or a good razor blade. It will prevail in the marketplace if it's better. And that those of us who work for newspapers, traditional organizations, just need to get our... Ben Bradley always said the way to get a story is nose down, ass up, moving slowly forward. And that's what we need to do.
Do they teach that in journalism school here? I don't know. It's probably pretty good advice. Speaking of which, we've got some questions that have been prepared by some members of the journalism program here at the University of Maine. We're going to go to a couple of those now. We'll get back to a few other questions later. I think we're joined by Samantha DePoy-Warren. Where's Samantha? Right there. Hi, Samantha. And thanks for joining us. I think you have a microphone, and you've got some questions that members of the journalism program have prepared.
Many questions, some of which you've already answered. I'm sure you've thought about this countless times, but what do you wish you had done differently when you were working the Watergate story?
I'm sorry,
I believe the question was, what do you wish you'd done differently while working the story?
Working the Watergate story? I wish we'd been smarter. I wish we'd been faster. It took us a long time to put it together. We made some mistakes. When we wrote the account in the book, All the President's Men, we identified our mistakes and things that we did. We realized one of the lessons of Watergate is no modified, limited hangout, but let it hang out fully. But there are flaws in something like that, and I could keep you here all afternoon, but Carl and I got a document at one point and realized that Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy, who were the two kind of operation chiefs of the Watergate operation, had gone to Los Angeles and spent time at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, and we had the dates and we had some information. We flew to Los Angeles, and, what were they doing here? What were they doing here? Well, we didn't find out what they were doing here. We spent a lot of Mrs. Graham's money and came up dry, and it turns out that's when they'd gone to burglarize the psychiatrist's office to Daniel Ellsberg, who had leaked the Pentagon Papers. And I said to myself, why didn't we know? We could have put things together, and we failed. One of many examples.
Yeah. Bill, do you have anything on that? Or?
No.
You didn't.
I did everything perfectly.
Well,
except your haircut at the time. Who was your barber?
Worked for Elvis,
or did you
obviously.
have one?
Lewiston.
Lewiston, yeah. No, but after, did you or other members of the committee, after that was over, ever say, we should have caught this sooner, we should have done this, we should have done that?
tell you what happened following the vote. A short time thereafter, there was a priest who was with Rensselaer in Indiana who came to Washington and said that he wanted to create an oral history of this coalition, the fragile coalition. What were the thoughts going through our minds as we were reaching a conclusion? And we sat around for a weekend down at Hilton Head around a tape recorder. And we sat and had...
7 of you.
The 7 of us.
7 congressmen.
And we sat around a table drinking libations, having a great old time, talking about what influenced us at the moment. And frankly, everybody came to a conclusion at a different point in time. There was only one meeting in which the 7 got together. It was the day before the hearings went public. And that was a meeting that was held at Tom Railsback's office. When he called up and said, would you like to come over tomorrow morning? We're having a few of us get together to see how this thing all shapes up. And I was telling Bob on the way up here this morning that I had no idea who was going to be in that room. I felt pretty lonely, frankly, during the course of the investigation or the committee's investigation. I felt that I was perhaps the only member who was out there.
Only Republican who was going to vote to recommend impeachment.
Yes, and I'll tell you what was going on behind closed doors. I had become so familiar with the facts, all of the tapes, all of the edited transcripts. I spent days, literally, with earphones over my head, listening to every nuance of what was being said in the Oval Office. And frequently behind closed doors, we each had 5 minutes to interrogate witnesses. And frequently, the Democratic members would yield their time to me, which made it very uncomfortable. I can tell you, the Republicans looking at me and Democrats yielding me the time. If they had one question, that was the one question. They'd say, I yield the balance of my time to Congressman Cohen. Well, it made it pretty uncomfortable. But I felt, okay, I've got 5 more minutes, and I can do the investigation. So I felt I was pretty much out there alone, and I didn't know whether there be anybody else that would agree that this was an abuse of power or an obstruction of justice. And when I walked into that room, Congressman Railsback's office that morning, it was the first time that any of us had gotten together. It was Railsback, Caldwell Butler from Virginia, Hamilton Fish from New York, Tom Mann from South Carolina, Walter Flowers from Alabama. No, 2 Democrats.
2 Democrats.
2 Democrats. And that was the first time, and they said, let's throw everything up in the air and see how this all shakes down. Is there anything we can agree on? And we all sat there and said, well, I think the following. And they said, we agree. And so then we went into the public hearing, and we got hit with a hammer. Charlie Sandman, that name rings a bell to you, congressman from New Jersey, said how vague this was. It was unconstitutionally vague to simply allege an abuse of power or an obstruction of justice. Where was the, quote, specificity? That was a word that kept being used during the course of the hearings. So we got hammered that first day with the press covering us, and here we were offering articles of impeachment, and Charlie Sandman and others were simply taking us to the cleaners, so to speak. Right after that hearing, we got together and said, okay, Cohen, you give all the specifics of the abuse of process of power or the obstruction of justice, and so you do this article. So I went back and then made the case for that particular article. We came out the next day, but that's how tenuous it was at that moment. We were on our heels after that first day of open hearings because we hadn't done enough of the homework to put every specific allegation that would support an article dealing with abuse of power or obstruction of justice.
So we can go back to Samantha for a minute. You've got a couple more questions, Samantha.
Sure. You've certainly gained the most attention for your coverage of Watergate, but what other stories have you covered that you're particularly proud of that maybe didn't captivate the nation as much?
Oh, well,
they all did, didn't they?
No, you know, I like your first question better. Because it goes right at the heart of the way I look at all of this, and that is what we miss, what we don't make sense out of, what we don't get to fast enough. And there's nothing I've done where I wouldn't, if given a do-over with knowledge, do it faster and hopefully better. Which gets to the point of what is journalism. And journalism is a snapshot, a look at something at a certain moment. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it looks into the future with great wisdom, and sometimes it's just dead wrong. And you have to accept that. But one of the things I found doing it for 37 years is it is a very cerebral process. It's not just going and saying, oh, cover this story, just start calling people at random. You really have to think about how you're approaching this story, the sequence of how you want to interview people, the sequence of going back to people, the sequence of questioning in an interview, how much time you're going to get, going at times of the day or at night when you can get people for hours. I don't like to. I mean, I can remember coming and having lunch with you, and we would talk for hours, and he wouldn't say a damn thing. But, sometimes, and then I'd go back and say, that was a wasted $1.50 for a tuna fish sandwich for Cohen.
Let me tell you about his technique, though. I mean, it is unique. Who was the character on television who used to go around the old raincoat?
Columbo.
Columbo. This is Columbo Incorporated. He would come in and say, Bill, I don't understand this. Can you explain this, because I'm confused? And you would say, oh, let me tell you how this all works. But he always pretends he doesn't know what's going on. And basically, he knows everything.
It's not an act.
No.
It's not an act, believe me.
Basically, he knows everything that's going on, and he's testing you because he has more information. He has more wires going into his office than AT&T has around the country. And so he already knows basically the answers he's looking for. He's testing you to say, are you going to be straight with me? Can you give me any additional information? But he always comes in with this confused, like, I don't understand. Do you understand it? And you just start babbling, and that's how he gets his stories.
It obviously works, doesn't it?
But, that's the big issues. Like, we're going to talk a little bit about this tonight, the Iraq War. It's confusing the more you know about it. It's complex. Watergate, Iran-Contra, the condition of the economy, global warming. I mean, if I were to do a book on global warming and were to come see anyone, I would walk in and say, I'm confused. And it would be genuine. So it's not a confusion born of not having done any work. It's confusion of having done enough work to realize that there's contrary information, that there are disputes about facts, and so forth. So,
they used to say, if 60 Minutes is calling, you know you're about to have a bad day. Same thing with Bob Woodward calls out. Says, I'm confused, and you know you're about to have a bad day.
But it'll just be delayed till the book comes out, right? Samantha, one more, please.
I'd be more worried if you were calling me than 60 Minutes. But what advice would you give to aspiring journalists?
Let me give an example. I'm going to cut this real short, and that is, and it's going to be an example with an anecdote. I went to work for the Washington Post in 1971, and before Watergate, I was doing a series of stories about restaurants in Washington who had health inspections, and they were failing the health inspections in a serious way, and they were closing the restaurants, including Ben Bradley's favorite French restaurant in Washington. And I had a source in the D.C. Health Department who would give me these documents. And so one morning he called me and said, the Mayflower Coffee Shop has just been closed down. It has the worst score in the history of sanitation inspections in the District of Columbia. Come on over and get it. So I got the report. And in the newspaper business, you like early copy to get something in early. So I wrote out the story. The Mayflower Coffee Shop and the Mayflower Hotel had the worst inspection in the history. And I don't even want to repeat. There were rat droppings floating in the soup and all kinds of things. And I wrote this out, and I gave it to the city editor, and he said, wow, that's a hell of a story, front page story. have you been there? And I said, no. And he said, well, let's see. It's 2.5 blocks away. Get your ass out of the chair and get over to the Mayflower Hotel. Okay, you know, a picky editor. So I go to the Mayflower Hotel and say, where's the coffee shop? We don't have one. You don't have one? No, we have Jean Louis and we have a buffet. No Mayflower coffee shop. So I get the document and I look and there's Mayflower coffee shop in a different address. Turns out, for reasons which I'll never understand fully, the Mayflower coffee shop was in the Statler Hilton Hotel, which was a half a block away from the Washington Post. So I went over to the Statler Hilton, found the Mayflower coffee shop. It was closed. They had a sign up, closed for remodeling, and got them to acknowledge. They had this inspection comments, and then went back to the city editor and said, could I have my copy back? I have a few small changes I'd like to make. Now,
The lesson?
the lesson seared into my brain. Don't assume. Go to the scene. There's no such thing as early copy. Get out there and check and check and check. And that really happened. What the advice to journalists is, take that story. I came back from that experience. I was trembling. I realized that if that story had been published on the front page, we would have had to run a front page correction, and you and I would have never met.
Want to go to some of the rest of you. Samantha, thank you very much. And I'm sure you will always go and visit the coffee shop before you write that story. I'd like to go to some of you for a few of your questions, and in the time that we have remaining, we've got some folks out there with microphones up in the aisle, and raise your hand and we'll find a few people with some questions. I think, do we have somebody right over here? And could you please tell us your name?
My name is Michael Palmer. I'm a professor of political science here for the last 25 years. My area is political theory. Secretary Cohen mentioned the pardon. I would like to hear from both of you. What did you think at the time of Ford's pardon of Nixon, or did you think he should have faced criminal charges? And what do you think in retrospect about the pardon, or do you think he should have faced criminal charges?
Thank you.
At the time, I didn't agree with it. At the time, I was caught up in the emotion of having gone through for, 7-8 months of intensive investigation, and then bearing all of what I thought were the burdens of taking that position, and simply having a complaint or an indictment, which had to go before the House of Representatives first, and then I assumed it would pass, and then go to a trial in the Senate. I said, this is the best way to really establish for the American people the truth of what we have alleged. But in retrospect, he did the right thing. I think looking back over it, had we insisted that it go forward and that he not grant the pardon, then I think it would have been a different mood, different outcome. I think Jerry Ford made a very courageous decision. Whatever his motivation was, I think they were the right motivations. Although I think you maybe have reported on this, he's had some recollection. There are some reports coming out now that Gerald Ford in his quiet moments may have had some second thoughts about the wisdom of having granted it. But nonetheless, I think it was the right thing to do, but I only came to that conclusion years later.
Mr. Woodward?
Real quickly, the pardon, Ford went on television in September 1974, about a month after becoming president, and announced the pardon. It was early Sunday morning. I think he did that because he was hoping no one would notice. And it was noticed. And I was asleep in a hotel room in New York, and my colleague Carl Bernstein called me with alarm in his voice. And he said, have you heard what happened? Well, I hadn't heard anything. I'd been asleep. And Carl, who then and still has the ability to say what happened in the fewest words with the most drama, said the following: "The son of a bitch pardoned the son of a bitch." Even I realized what had happened at that moment, and for a long time I thought that it was dirty, that there was a deal, that 40 people went to jail because of Watergate, and the guy at the top gets off. 25 years later, I undertook a book called Shadow, Watergate, Legacy of Watergate in 5 Presidents: Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush Sr., and Clinton. And I called Jerry Ford up and said, I'm working on this. So this is 1997, 10 years ago. And I had not met or interviewed Ford. And he said, yeah, come on, we'll talk. So I interviewed him for hours and hours in New York, at his place in Aspen, at his place in California, looked at all the memoirs, went to the Ford Library, got the lawyers' documents, interviewed everyone who was still alive. And Ford told me he had been offered a deal, but maintained he rejected it, and he made a compelling argument about why the pardon was necessary. Namely, he wanted to have his own presidency. The country needed to get over Watergate. If Nixon was indicted, tried, even went to jail, we'd have 2 or 3 more years of Watergate. He had information that Nixon might take his own life or harm himself. He was in such despair. And so he did this. And I wrote this out in the first 3 chapters of Shadow. And Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of the late President Kennedy, called me up, said, I read this, and we are going to give Gerald Ford the Profiles in Courage Award at the Kennedy Library. And then they called Ford, and there was Teddy Kennedy, who denounced the pardon as much as, he was vocally suspicious as you and I were, saying Gerald Ford did a courageous thing. The importance of that is not just in that one event, but the lesson of, at a certain point in history, it looks a certain way and you're absolutely sure, and then time goes on and there are more facts that emerge, there's more kind of cool analysis, and you realize that you had it absolutely wrong. That's another thing seared into my brain about the business. Don't jump to overall conclusions, because there may be other conclusions that are even better supported.
Question over here. Where's our...
I did tell Ford that story about Carl's call. And he laughed and laughed, and I said that I've revised my opinion of you, but not the other.
Okay.
Hi, Joanne Daphne. I'm wondering if you could ruminate on what the benefits to our country might be if the current president were impeached, or would it be better for our country if accountability came some other way?
Thank you.
All yours.
I think the danger in this country is that the word impeachment is invoked too often. I was talking again to Bob on the way up on this morning, and I remember quoting from Lord Chancellor Somers during the Watergate hearings, and I remember that vividly when I went back to look into English history, because we didn't really know much about impeachment. There had been only one impeachment trial in our history, and that was with Andrew Johnson, nearly 100 years before, more than 100 years before the Watergate, in which a prominent member of the Maine delegation, William Pitt Fessenden, played a serious role in that impeachment debate. But Chancellor Somers said that impeachment was like Goliath's sword. to be removed from the temple on great occasions only. Whenever you're going to reverse the public's will, you've had 2 elections now. The public has voted for President Bush. To pull out impeachment and say, we don't like what he has done, we don't like what he has said, or we think that he has lied to us, he has taken us into a war that's not only unpopular but seemingly endless. The end of that is, or the accountability is, that ultimately you will judge him, you will judge the party, the people who supported whatever policy he has advocated. So there's always going to be accountability, ultimately, politically, within 4 years or 8 years. But I think that by turning to impeachment, say, we don't trust him anymore, or we don't like him anymore, or we think that he has misled us, or he has abused his power, you have to make a compelling case. And that should be overwhelming before you remove the sword from the temple, from the scabbard. And it seems to me that I have not seen that kind of evidence that would warrant that. If you had absolute evidence of criminality as opposed to a political position or a sense that he's in charge and he has these expansive executive powers, he doesn't have to be accountable to the Congress, he doesn't have to get court permission to wiretap. All of those issues are now being debated. And frankly, Congress, in my judgment, has abdicated its responsibilities. And had you had a much more, a Congress much more engaged, much more demanding, much less willing to be caught up in the emotion of the moment, saying, well, it's a time of war, and therefore we give it all away, then you wouldn't be arguing or even suggesting impeachment at this point. Again, in the absence of criminality, and you don't have to commit a crime in order to be impeached. I argued that point myself. Basically, you can have an abuse of power without necessarily committing a crime. But nonetheless, I think in this particular case, we're much better to do what's going on right now, to have this debate. The presidential campaign is certainly focused upon this issue. The Democrats will make Iraq the major issue of next year. Republicans will be held accountable. Those who have supported the president without any qualification will have a much more difficult time during the elections. So I think there are enough checks and balances. You can get away with that abuse of power for 4 years, potentially 8 years. Beyond that, the system has a way of correcting itself. And I think that's what's taking place in terms of the press now being much more aggressive than it was the first 4 years, much more challenging, much more skeptical. And that's the way it should be. I mean, we should always want to have a press that is questioning, that's skeptical of statements coming out of government. Someone once said, seek the truth and the truth will set you free, but it's going to make you very uncomfortable in the process. It's going to be very painful in the process. That's what happened during Watergate. We went after the truth. It set us free in the sense we're back to this balance of power between the checks and balances of our institutions. And that's the way democracies ought to function, and not simply as a monarchy. Would you like to respond
I mean,
to that?
real quickly, the dirty little secret in the war, if you go back to the decision to go to war, yes, it was Bush's decision. He can employ the force, the U.S. military, as he sees fit as commander-in-chief. I was making this point to a very large group a couple of weeks ago, and the people were saying, no, wait a minute, Congress has to declare war and so forth. Not so, and I wasn't getting through, and I said, look, the president can invade Mexico tomorrow if he chooses. And somebody stood up in the back and shouted, don't give him any ideas. But he can. And the Congress voted 3-1 before the war, giving him a blank check to go to war. The climate of opinion at the time was, you thought the war was reasonable.
No. I thought it was reasonable to say, did we, in the Clinton administration, myself included, believe that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction? And the answer was, it was reasonable to believe that because it was based upon a reasonable assumption. He had them, he had used them, he had refused
But you
to
didn't
account for them.
oppose the war, did you?
I did
at
not.
the time.
I did not support going forward. What I
You didn't.
You know what I here's the.
You can tell.
No.
Yeah,
this
yeah.
takes.
Did you
No,
touch
There's lots of movement in the chair
No.
up here.
Well, I want to be perfectly clear to someone who really reserves judgment and not reaching any conclusions. Now, we in the Clinton administration, I'm edgy on this because I've tried not to be critical of a decision maker since I wasn't there at the time. I can only tell you what I saw. And what I saw at the time that I was in office is that Saddam Hussein, we assumed he had weapons of mass destruction. We did not think he posed an imminent threat to the United States or to anyone in the region because we thought we had him reasonably well contained. No-fly zones in the north, no-fly zones in the south. We were decimating his air defense system. So we assumed he had weapons of mass destruction, but we had no intent of going into Iraq unless we had to, unless he invaded Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, or attacked Israel, or unless he started taking down our airplanes. Then we had a plan, and that plan called for up to 500,000 troops to go in. So we didn't see the necessity, and frankly, I didn't see the imperative necessity to go in because he posed an immediate or imminent threat. But I assumed, like President Bush and everybody else in the administration, he did in fact have weapons of mass destruction. And had I been in favor of going in saying there was an imminent threat, I would have said 400,000 to 500,000 troops. That was our plan. That's why I took a little time to explain.
At the time, the Democratic establishment, look, John Kerry, Hillary Clinton voted to authorize the war. The political, journalistic, academic, and whatever kind of community basically, there were some exceptions, but basically supported the war. And to now then come back and say, oh, it hasn't turned out well, we're going to impeach, is probably not a remedy that's going to get very far because too many people were in on it, quite frankly. And too many people who were in on it trying to say, oh, no, I wasn't in on it. Well, people were in on it. And, anyway.
And a nice little promotion for the talk that's coming tonight that will touch in much more detail on the Iraq matters. Let's see if we can get one more question from our audience. Who do we have over on this side, Mr. Microphone?
Mr. Woodward, Nathan Stormer, I teach here. You said earlier that the best product will win out. Could you revisit that in light of the fact that some voices get an extensive amount of time and space and others get very little, and frequently the ones with lots of space do sloppy work? How is it that better product, in that environment, what should or can be done about the fact that we get a lot of information which is fairly poorly vetted or, frankly, highly misleading?
Well, it is, but it's the job of the journalist to sift through that. And just because somebody seems a little on the margin doesn't mean they're wrong, and it's the journalist's job to figure that out. I mean, just to get into the complete hair shirt on Iraq, I wrote a story before the Iraq War on the front page of the Washington Post saying there is no smoking gun intelligence that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. I had 3 sources who told me that the evidence about WMD in Iraq was much skimpier than they were saying. And I did not pursue that aggressively enough. I should have known from the experience that you and I, from myself as a journalist and you as a congressman, that the standard always in journalism, law, impeachment, is smoking gun intelligence. Good, high-quality, provable intelligence. And I should have known when people were telling me that and wrote that there was no smoking gun intelligence, that there's something wrong here. That the proclamations of he has WMD and worry about the mushroom cloud on the horizon and so forth was a grotesque overstatement. I was not aggressive enough at all in doing that. And again, even at age 64, you learn lessons.
Well, to give you one final comment on that, again, we assumed he had weapons of mass destruction. Those of us who had were serving in public office at that time, we actually attacked. I had recommended that we go after Saddam Hussein in a very discreet way, as we did in Desert Fox, in which we had a 3.5, 4-day air campaign to take out his missile.
In 1998, when you were Secretary of Defense.
Yes.
I should have done that.
No, I just was...
So we conducted a very limited...
When you say we, people think you're talking about the Republican Party.
We who were in office at the Pentagon at that time, I who was Secretary of Defense at that moment, had recommended that we take out the missile production facilities based on the intelligence that we had. But it was going to be very narrow, very limited, and for a very short duration, and we were not going in on the ground. But it was based on intelligence, and we were assured that this, in fact, posed a significant threat to the extent that that missile facility continued to be developed. And so that's when we decided to go forward. But once again, you base it upon the information you get. If you're a reporter, you obviously will put a higher degree of skepticism on that information than perhaps we did at the time, but we tried our level best to say, is this really good? Is this solid information? Because you should never go to war or launch an attack unless you have the best possible information you can get.
But Bill, isn't the lesson there that you didn't decide to invade with 500,000?
Right.
And in fact, that strike in Desert Fox was in a sense a punishment strike directed at Saddam, who was not permitting the UN authorized weapons inspections to go ahead.
Exactly.
And so what you're doing is important. You need a level of evidence that's very high, but you're not committing the country to a massive invasion of another country.
Bob just made my point. We talk about the doctrine of preemption, and we're living in a time in which the threats to our existence, certainly substantial elements of our existence, can be blown away in not nanoseconds, but matters of moments. And so then the question becomes, should you be able to take preemptive action? And the answer is yes. Preemption has always been part of any country's power, even legal authority, provided you have two things. Number one, you have really good intelligence. Someone else is about to attack you. And number two, that attack is imminent. It is coming. It's not next year. It's not that he may develop nuclear weapons 2 to 3 or 5 years from now. It is imminent. Because if you start to lower the threshold on the doctrine of preemption, then you send a signal to everybody else. Pakistan, India, we have information. The other country's about to attack. Let's go first.
Iran?
Any country you're talking about, you better get intelligence, it better be good, and the threat must be imminent before you attack first. So that's something that I always felt very deeply about. When I was Secretary of Defense, I was very reluctant to commit troops to any kind of a combat situation, because I looked at the young men and women who were serving us as my sons and daughters. And I said, these are my children, and I'm not going to put them in harm's way unless I absolutely have to do so. And that's the way in which I approached it. Now, is that too cautionary? Is it too timid? I don't think so. And when you entrust your son and daughter to me, you say, Mr. Cohen, I want you to make sure before you put my child in harm's way, you better be right or as close to right as you can possibly be. And that's the way I approached it.
Since our time's just about up, I wanted to steer it back to Watergate. One final question, a personal one for both of you. At the time of the break-in, Mr. Woodward, you were a rookie first-year reporter, I believe, on the Washington Post, and Secretary Cohen, you were not even elected yet.
I was running for office.
You were running for office, and you were 32. You were 29. Have you, over the years, ever stopped to think about the role of fate and that all those events and where your lives would have led had it not been for Watergate? Maybe not.
I would have been the editor of the Lewiston Courier-Mail.
I still would have been a member of the House of Representatives. But I don't think I would ever have risen above that for many years. I think fate has something to do with it. Chance has a lot to do with it. I mentioned just by going to the Institute of Politics and being told, put the committee you want last, and going to Washington and my staff saying, don't go on the Judiciary Committee. What's wrong with you? They only deal with issues that will kill you back home, abortion and prayer in public school. That's all they do is debate those issues that can only harm you. And I said, no, I really want to be on the Judiciary Committee. I love it on. So I put it last. Is that fate? Is that spinning the roulette wheel? Is it the hand of providence? I mean, it's that wonderful quote about life must be lived forward, but it can only be understood backwards. And you think of all of us who are in this room today, where we started, where we are today, and you look back over your shoulder and say, how did I get here? How did I end up in this particular place at this particular moment? Look at all the decisions I made, decisions I didn't make, how much luck was involved, how much had to do with my parents' guidance, what were those momentary diversions that took me down one path and not the other. We all try to, toward the end of our lives, look back and speculate exactly why we did what we did and why we're here where we are. And whether that's fate or providence or simply a lot of luck, I think it's probably a combination of everything.
Or as the late actor John Wayne put the other side of that issue, life is tough, but life is tougher if you're stupid.
I had this elegant quote about fortune favors the prepared mind, but I think yours is a lot better. Bill Cohen, Bob Woodward, thank you both very much for being with us.